Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling said when Hannah Clarke walked into Oak Creek Memorial 3 months ago. Not her name. Not a greeting. A category. A dismissal. He didn't see the hands that moved with surgical precision even while stacking supply trays in the break room. He didn't see the woman who'd held a collapsing field hospital together for 16 hours under siege in Sanjin Valley. He saw only the Navy scrubs, the quiet efficiency, the way she never made eye contact in the hallway. Dead wrong about who was standing in his hospital. Oak Creek Memorial smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum with the constancy of a life support machine. Hannah moves through the corridors with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Nothing here matches the weight she carries in her shoulders. 3 months she's been here. 3 months of charting patient vitals with meticulous precision, verifying every medication administration, documenting protocols with the exactness of someone who understands that details save lives. Her locker on the 3rd floor holds a cracked mug with a faded anchor emblem, a dying succulent from her previous life, and nothing else. No photos. No names. No evidence. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her old jacket at home, that's the only thing left that proves Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke ever existed at all. When she reaches for 4 supplies, the fluorescent lights catch something the hospital's HR department never asked about: faint scars on her forearms, parallel lines like shrapnel patterns, like the kind of marks you get when a field hospital's metal walls collapse inward under mortar fire. She never mentions them. Nobody asks. The scrubs cover most of it anyway. Dr. Sterling arrives in the nurse's station at 1:03 p.m. on a Wednesday, expensive shoes clicking against linoleum like a metronome counting down to something. He wears a $12,000 watch and carries himself like a man who's never been told no. The surgical team clusters around him, 3 junior doctors, 2 residents, 1 attending who has learned to laugh at whatever he finds funny. Sterling grins, that predatory thing that happens when a man knows he has leverage, and announces to the gathered staff that he's betting $50, cash, right here, anyone who wants a piece of it, that Hannah Clarke quits within a week. He's been here for years and seen plenty of good nurses come through. Never seen one with her quiet. Never seen one who doesn't push back. She'll be gone by Friday, Sterling says. His voice is smooth, confident. Who wants the action? Hannah's hands don't shake. She doesn't look up from the patient chart she's been updating, vitals at 08 for 7, medication reconciliation complete, 2 discrepancies flagged that shouldn't be there. She takes 1 measured breath. The kind that comes from discipline, not from fear. From knowing that reactions are information, and information gets you killed in places like Sanjin. She continues writing. Continues documenting. Continues being invisible. By 1:15 p.m., Sterling finds her in the cafeteria. She's standing at a table with her tray balanced on one hand, chicken breast, steamed vegetables, water. Fuel. Nothing more. Sterling approaches from behind and bumps her shoulder hard enough that the entire tray leaves her grip. It falls like a body falling. Lunch scatters across the tile floor. The crash echoes. The room goes quiet. Every conversation stops. Every eye turns. This is the moment he's designed for: public, witnessed, humiliating. He's testing her. Hunting for the flinch that will confirm his bet, his power, his rightness about exactly who she is. Hannah doesn't make a sound. She doesn't curse. She doesn't storm away. She kneels down on the tile floor, right there in front of the entire surgical team, in front of the residents, in front of 2 attending physicians who suddenly find their trays very interesting. She begins gathering scattered vegetables. A piece of chicken. A broken plate. Her movements are steady. Efficient. The kind of steady that comes from having done much harder things in much worse circumstances. She's carried wounded men twice Sterling's weight through Sanjin under mortar fire. She's held arterial bleeders closed with her bare hands for 43 minutes while waiting for a medevac. She's cleaned up worse than lunch on a hospital floor. Sterling stands over her with his arms crossed. His smile doesn't waver. He's winning. That's what he thinks. That's what he needs to believe. Hannah finishes cleaning without looking at him. She stands. She deposits the scattered food into the waste bin. She walks to the sink and rinses her hands. The soap smells like industrial rose. When she's finished, when her hands are clean and her composure is exactly where it needs to be, she turns and meets his eyes across the cafeteria. For the first time in 3 months, she really looks at him. And Sterling feels something shift. Just for a moment. Just enough to tell him he might have miscalculated something. But then he pushes the feeling away. She's just a nurse. She quits or she stays. Either way, he wins the bet. By 5:11 p.m. that same evening, Sterling finds her again. She's alone in the supply corridor, inventorying medications, when he appears and drops a patient chart at her feet with the kind of force that means it's deliberately cruel. His tone is refined, almost playful. "Pick that up, sweetheart." It's the kind of endearment that's not an endearment at all. It's a weapon. It's designed to diminish, to control, to force compliance in front of authority. He's testing her again. Still hunting for the break. She doesn't pick it up immediately. She finishes writing her current notation, medication count verified, no discrepancies in this batch, but 3 others flagged for review, and then she sets down her pen. Deliberately. With precision. She looks at the chart on the floor. Then at him. And when she meets his eyes, something in her voice changes. It drops half an octave. It's quiet, but it fills the entire corridor like a pressure change before a storm. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through Sanjin under mortar fire. I've held their organs together with my hands while their blood soaked through my uniform. This is nothing." She pauses. Not even a little bit hard. She doesn't pick up the chart. She walks past him. Her movements have shifted. Subtle. Barely noticeable. But Sterling sees it. The fluidity is gone, replaced by something more dangerous. Military precision. The kind of bearing that comes from having trained for things civilians don't have language for. What Hannah doesn't know is that Sterling has been watching her charts. All 97 of them. She's a problem, not because she's incompetent, but because she's too competent. For nearly 2 years, Sterling has been inflating billing codes on surgical procedures, shifting costs upward by $847 to $1,200 per case. 2 years of pharmaceutical kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, payments that arrive in his checking account every month like clockwork, totaling $63,000 so far. It's been clean. Nobody looks too carefully. Charts are filed. Insurance pays. Life continues. But then Hannah Clarke arrived, and she started verifying things. Not aggressive verification. Not the kind that gets noticed. Just meticulous, methodical, protocol-based checking. She flags discrepancies in billing codes. She questions medication costs. She verifies that the supplies documented in surgical records actually match the supplies used. She doesn't accuse anyone. She just marks them in the system. Notes them. Flags them for the compliance auditor who reviews them quarterly. And Sterling realizes, standing in that supply corridor watching her walk away with the military bearing of someone who survived things he can't imagine, that she's a threat. Not because she's hunting him, but because her diligence is going to expose him whether she means to or not. What Hannah also doesn't know is that Sterling has already made his decision. She has to go. Before her meticulous charting attracts the wrong kind of attention. Before someone from the hospital's compliance office starts asking questions he can't answer. Before $50 becomes a federal investigation. The bet will go uncollected. She won't quit in a week. But she will be gone by the end of the month. One way or another. Hannah walks back to the nurse's station and continues her work. 3 more charts to verify. Medication counts to reconcile. Protocols to document. She doesn't know about Sterling's fraud. Doesn't know about the conspiracy of silence he's built with 2 pharmaceutical representatives and 3 board members who benefit from the inflated costs. She only knows that something is wrong with the numbers, the way you know something is wrong in a combat zone, by the pattern, by the inconsistency, by the small details that don't add up to a coherent whole. She'll keep documenting. Keep flagging. Keep doing her job with the precision that comes from knowing that people die when you're careless. Sterling, meanwhile, is already calculating his next move. The bet was stage 1, public humiliation, an attempt to break her down through social pressure. That didn't work. She's tougher than he anticipated. So he moves to stage 2. He begins making calls to people who owe him favors. The emergency call came through at 0200 hours. Appendectomy. Delta Force colonel transferred from Fort Stewart with complications from shrapnel removal, a training accident that had gone sideways 3 days prior. Hannah was pulling charts when the overhead speaker crackled, trauma alert, incoming surgical, prep OR2. She was already moving, muscle memory taking over before conscious thought caught up. Dr. Sterling stood in the surgical suite doorway, already scrubbed, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and barely concealed contempt. He looked at Hannah as she entered, gloved and ready. "Let's see if our new nurse can handle real medicine, shall we?" His voice carried that practiced condescension, the kind that had broken 3 nurses before her. She didn't respond. Didn't blink. She arranged the instrument tray with movements precise enough to cut glass, each clamp and retractor positioned exactly where it needed to be. That wasn't nurse training. That was muscle memory from a field hospital where every second mattered and trembling hands got people killed. The colonel was already under, sedated, his fever spiking at 103.4. His left side had taken shrapnel from a fragmentation exercise that detonated wrong, and the initial extraction at Fort Stewart had missed something. Peritonitis was setting in fast. Sterling made his first incision with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never doubted himself in his life, and Hannah assisted with the kind of precision that made the difference between sloppy and surgical. She anticipated his moves before he made them. When he needed a retractor, her hand was there. When he called for suction, it was already present. Sterling frowned slightly, not used to having someone who didn't slow him down. The colonel's abdomen was a map of inflammation and infection. Sterling worked through the adhesions with methodical precision, talking through the procedure in that loud, performative way surgeons do when they want witnesses to their brilliance. Hannah said nothing. Just worked. The antiseptic smell hung thick and sterile, cut only by the sharp metallic scent of blood and the high-pitched whine of the ventilator pushing air into the colonel's lungs. Beep! 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 The heart monitor maintained its steady rhythm. Then it happened. The colonel's eyes opened. Not fully, his sedation kept him locked in that space between unconsciousness and fever dream, but his pupils found focus. His gaze traveled across the surgical field, past Sterling, and landed directly on Hannah's hands. On the specific way her fingers moved. The suture pattern she was using to tie off a bleeder, the precise technique, the angle of her knots, the spacing. His lips parted. His voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper, that suture pattern. Only combat medics from the Sanjin Field Hospital tied it that way. Hannah's hands didn't stop moving. Didn't hesitate. Didn't tremble. But every cell in her body went electric. Recognition flickered between them like heat lightning. This man had been there. Different unit, different squad, but Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province, the same timeline. He'd seen the field hospital. He'd seen the chaos. He'd seen the Navy corpsmen who held it together when the siege lasted 16 hours and the medevac birds couldn't fly and 4 operators didn't come home. Her face remained professionally blank. A mask of clinical focus. Sterling glanced up briefly, saw nothing out of the ordinary, returned to his work. Hannah finished the suture with movements that were controlled, precise, absolutely steady. The colonel's eyes closed again, pulled back under by the propofol in his full line. But for 3 seconds, they had recognized each other. For 3 seconds, the buried past hadn't stayed buried. The procedure completed at 03 for 7 hours. Appendix out. Infection source eliminated. Drainage tube placed. Sterling closed with his typical overconfidence, already mentally moving on to the next case, the next opportunity to demonstrate superiority. Hannah began stripping the surgical field, removing instruments with the same meticulous precision she'd applied to everything else. Not a single clamp clattered. Not a single tray shifted. Just quiet, competent work. She scrubbed out alone. The water was hot, nearly scalding, and she held her hands under it longer than necessary. The surgical soap smelled like artificial lavender and something chemical that couldn't be named. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash, from the collision of 2 timelines that were supposed to stay separate. She rinsed. Dried. And in the reflection of the dark window above the sink, 1 tear escaped before she could stop it. Just 1. She wiped it away without breaking stride, without letting her breath catch, without any of the external signs of what was happening inside. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. In the recovery room, the colonel lay sedated and stable, his vital signs holding at acceptable parameters. Hannah reviewed his chart, his real chart, not Sterling's inflated version. Oxygen saturation 96%. Blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate 68. Everything exactly as it should be. She'd written it all down with the kind of detail that came from 16 years of medical training and 4 years of combat experience. Specific times. Specific medications. Specific dosages. Each entry documented with a precision that would make any military medical inspector proud. Sterling entered the recovery room shortly after, his freshly scrubbed surgeon swagger radiating territorial dominance. He reviewed her charting, his jaw tightening with each line. The medication dosages she'd recorded didn't align with the codes he'd submitted to billing, dosages inflated by 30%, sometimes 40%, to justify the kickbacks he'd been receiving from Meridian Pharmaceuticals for the past 18 months. Her documentation was too accurate. Too detailed. Too military-precise. It highlighted the discrepancies he'd carefully hidden from every other oversight system. She'd been here 3 months, and already her charting was a liability. He closed the chart with more force than necessary. "Your documentation is thorough, Nurse Clarke." His tone made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. Perhaps a bit too thorough. Hospital procedure typically requires, he paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone laying a trap. A lighter touch. Simpler notes. Nothing too complex. Hannah met his eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. "I document what I observe, Doctor." Precise information saves lives. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Sterling smiled, the kind of smile a predator gives before it moves, calculated and cold. "We'll see." He set the chart down on the bedside table with controlled precision. "We'll see how long that approach lasts." He left the recovery room. Hannah stood at the colonel's bedside, listening to the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the sound of the hospital continuing its endless work around them. Her hand rested on the bed rail. Her knuckles were white. In her jacket pocket, still in the locker 3 floors below, a faded unit patch was sewn into the lining, the emblem of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, from a life that was supposed to be erased. A life that was now sitting in a hospital bed in Savannah, Georgia, where he'd just recognized her hands. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling had finally realized exactly what kind of threat she represented. Hour 16 post-op, the colonel's oxygen saturation began its slow descent. 88%. 84. The monitor's rhythm was subtle at first, a whisper nobody else was hearing yet. Hannah caught it while restocking the crash cart 2 rooms down, her eyes tracking the continuous feed on the hallway monitor the way her hands once tracked muzzle flash in Sanjin, not with panic, but with the terrible clarity that comes from knowing what numbers mean when they're falling. She moved toward the ICU bay without thinking, muscle memory older than her nursing license pulling her forward. The colonel lay propped at 45 degrees, post-operative swelling still tracking across his features. His chest rose and fell, but something was wrong with the geometry of it. The right side was lagging. His breathing had that labored quality, not asthmatic, not cardiac. Something structural. She touched the monitor screen, reading the trend line like a map, O2 down, heart rate up and climbing, blood pressure narrowing as his body began the mathematics of desperation. The trachea was deviated. She could see it in the subtle shift of his neck, the way his windpipe had been shoved left by something expanding on the right side of his chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung trapping air under pressure. Not detected during the surgical closure. Missed. Hidden in the post-operative imaging that Sterling had signed off on with the same careless signature he used for his inflated billing codes. The crash cart was 6 steps away. The code button was 8. Hannah knew which one she should use. Protocol. Chain of command. The proper lane that Dr. Sterling had spent 3 months reminding her never to leave. She turned toward the hallway and stopped. Sterling was already there, coming out of the medication room with his shoulders back, that particular angle of his face that meant he'd already heard the monitor alarm from his phone, the attending physician's blessing and curse, always connected, always watching, always in control. "I've got him," Sterling said. His voice was smooth. Almost kind. "You update the post-op charts in the East Wing. We're behind on documentation." Hannah's jaw tightened. Not visible. Just the small muscles at the hinge of her jaw contracting like she was grinding stone. His oxygen's dropping. Tension pneumo from a mist. "I said I've got him." Sterling was already moving past her, his expensive cologne preceding him like a boundary she wasn't allowed to cross. "Stay in your lane, nurse nobody. East Wing. Now." He closed the ICU door behind him. Through the reinforced glass window, Hannah watched him approach the colonel's bed with the deliberate slowness of a man who had all the time in the world. He placed one hand on the patient's shoulder. He looked at the monitor. He didn't touch the oxygen, didn't check the chest for the asymmetrical breath sounds that would confirm what Hannah had diagnosed, didn't move toward the supplies. The colonel's lips were beginning to turn blue. 80% on the monitor. 78. The numbers were falling like a countdown. Sterling turned slightly and made eye contact with her through the window. Not a glance. A full, deliberate moment of eye contact while the patient's oxygen saturation dropped. His expression didn't change. The smallest lift at the corner of his mouth. Hannah understood in that second what was happening. Sterling wasn't slow. He was deliberate. If the colonel died, if this patient went into cardiac arrest right now, with Hannah having raised a concern and then been ordered to leave, with Sterling as the last hands-on care, then the investigation into Hannah's credentials wouldn't matter anymore. The court of inquiry wouldn't care that she'd identified a misdiagnosis. They would care that she'd been fired from her last 3 positions, that her references had holes in them the size of classified operations, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke officially did not exist because the Pentagon had erased her after San Jin, after the operation went sideways and 4 operators didn't come home and the decision was made that she should disappear, should become invisible, should never surface again. Sterling would survive. The investigation would die with the patient. She didn't walk to the East Wing. Instead, she moved backward into the medication room, her mind running through the topography of the ICU the way she'd once run through the maps of Helmand Province. Crash cart location. Supply locations. Needle gauges organized by size. Her hands were already moving, reaching, finding the 14-gauge needle, the same gauge she'd used on a Marine corporal in 2009 when the IED pressure wave had collapsed his lung and he was drowning in air trapped between his ribs and his chest wall. Different hospital. Different decade. Same physics. Same calculus of survival. She didn't announce herself. She didn't wait for the code team that Sterling hadn't called. She pushed through the ICU door and moved to the bedside with the kind of fluid certainty that makes people step back without thinking, the same presence that had once made Taliban fighters hesitate for the half-second it took her to move them out of the way. "You're not authorized," Sterling said. His voice had gone high. "Tight. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line," Hannah replied. Her voice had dropped an octave. Gone flat. The voice of someone who had stopped asking permission a long time ago. She found the landmarks on the colonel's chest with her fingertips, located the space between the ribs where the needle needed to go. The skin was warm, slightly damp with the early sweat of hypoxia. She prepped with an alcohol wipe, muscle memory from 1,000 procedures, from battlefield expedients where alcohol wipes were luxury, and inserted the needle with the kind of controlled pressure that comes from hands that understand tissue resistance, from knowing exactly how deep to push before the pleural space gives way. The hiss filled the room. It was a sound Hannah hadn't heard in 14 years. The unmistakable whisper of pressurized air escaping, the tension releasing, the lung expanding, the patient's body getting its oxygen back. The colonel's chest rose with a sudden, gulping breath. His eyes flew open and locked directly on Hannah's, and in that moment of recognition something passed between them that didn't need words. He'd seen the Sanjin Field Hospital. He'd seen her work. He'd seen her hands do exactly this before, in the dark, under fire. The monitor began its climb. 78. 82. 88. 92. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway. His face had gone the color of old porcelain, then shifted to something darker, a purple that started at his jawline and climbed toward his hairline. His hands were shaking. His mouth was working on words that wouldn't come out in order. But that wasn't what Hannah noticed most. Sterling was reaching for his phone before the colonel's oxygen hit 95%. He was dialing while she was still confirming the needle placement. He was stepping into the hallway while Hannah was checking for a hiss of air that wasn't coming anymore, which meant the pneumothorax was releasing correctly, which meant the patient was going to stabilize, which meant Sterling's backup plan had just evaporated. Within 8 minutes, the first board member arrived. Not called by Sterling's clinical assessment. Called by Sterling's panic. Dr. Marvin Hayes, Chief of Hospital Operations, a man whose Rolex probably cost more than Hannah made in a year, entering the ICU with a folder under his arm and a predatory expression. Within 19 minutes, 2 more arrived, Dr. Clarence Bancroft from finance and someone Hannah didn't recognize from what she later learned was an external compliance firm Sterling had already retained, already briefed, already set in motion like dominoes balanced on a razor's edge. They didn't ask about the patient's oxygen levels. They didn't ask about the needle decompression. They asked about Hannah's credentials. They asked about her employment history, the gaps, the reasons she'd left her previous positions. They asked questions that had answers, answers that Sterling had already provided, answers that painted her as unstable, unreliable, a nurse with a history of unauthorized procedures and questionable clinical judgment. Sterling stood nearby while they talked, his face pale but his voice steady now, his breathing controlled. He was in his element. This was strategy. This was the thing he was actually good at. He'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of making evidence disappear, of keeping investigators looking in the wrong direction, of using institutional machinery like a weapon. A patient's life was nothing. A nurse's career was less than nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the phone call that came through at 1,347 hours while the compliance investigator was reviewing the surgical charts. Sterling took it in the hallway, and Hannah heard his voice shift from controlled to obsequious, from angry to submissive. Her references. He'd already called them. The military cover identities she'd been given when she disappeared 14 years ago, the civilian jobs that were never really jobs, the personnel files that had been erased from official record by direct order of someone whose name she didn't even know. Those references were hollow now. They wouldn't hold under scrutiny. They'd been designed to protect her from a past, not from someone actively attacking them. Sterling emerged from his phone call with a smile that looked like he'd learned it from a manual about how facial expressions work. He handed the folder to Dr. Hayes and said, very quietly, words that Hannah caught because she was listening for them. Check with Mercy General in Jacksonville. Check with St. Catherine's in Atlanta. Check with her references from the last 3 assignments. They're going to tell you exactly what kind of nurse we're dealing with. Rubber gloves snapped somewhere in the distance. A monitor beeped 3 times. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. And Hannah Clarke stood in the ICU of Oak Creek Memorial in Savannah, Georgia, with her hand still steady and her face still calm, and understood that she had just been very efficiently boxed into a corner by someone who had been planning this exact moment since the day she'd walked into his hospital 3 months ago and started writing down things he didn't want written. The colonel was stable now. His oxygen was 96%. His color was coming back. He was going to live. And nobody was going to ask him about the suture pattern Hannah had used during his appendectomy, or why a combat medic from Sanjin was working as an invisible nurse in a Savannah hospital, or what the real reason was that she'd disappeared from official military record 14 years ago. They were going to ask why her credentials didn't match her employment history. And they were going to find out that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke didn't exist anymore. Not on paper. Not in any database that mattered. Not to anyone except the people who had ordered her erased. Sterling was already on his phone again, calling the next board member, setting up the next meeting, beginning the process that would end exactly the way he'd planned it, with Hannah removed, with the investigation into his billing fraud redirected toward fraud investigations of her personnel record, with her character destroyed before anyone could connect his pharmaceutical kickbacks to the patient deaths that his inflated billing codes had subsidized. The smile on his face was the smile of a man who understood that sometimes the best way to survive an attack is to eliminate the person attacking you before they even realize they're in a war. By that evening, Dr. Sterling had made 7 phone calls. The compliance investigator arrived at 4:27 p.m., a thin man in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio that felt like a coffin lid closing. Hannah watched from the medication station as Sterling guided him toward the ICU administrative office. She didn't stop working. Her hands moved through the routine, organizing discharge paperwork, cross-referencing medication logs, the kind of precision that had kept patients alive in places where precision meant the difference between breathing and not breathing. The investigator pulled a chair closer to the desk. Sterling's voice carried through the hallway, crisp and concerned. "We need someone who can ensure our protocols are being followed." The investigator nodded, opening his portfolio to reveal printed pages, Hannah's employment application, her nursing school transcripts, her references checked and verified. Except they weren't verified. Not really. The first reference was a hospital in Portland that had closed in 2019. The second was a clinic in Seattle that never answered the phone because no clinic by that name existed. The third was a private practice in San Diego run by a Dr. Marcus Chen who, when the investigator finally reached him, confirmed that yes, he remembered Hannah Clarke, but the gaps in his memory were strange, calculated, the kind of gaps that happened when someone had been trained to say just enough to convince without revealing anything. The investigator had been doing this for 23 years. He recognized a cover story. He recognized it the way a cardiologist recognizes the subtle whisper of mitral regurgitation. You couldn't see it, but you could hear it if you were listening for it. By 5:27 p.m., the investigator had printed his findings. 42 pages. Hannah's credentials traced backward through layers of false identities like trying to find the bottom of a well that had no bottom. Naval service record, incomplete. Civilian nursing licenses, registered to addresses that had been demolished. References, all connected to organizations that either no longer existed or had no record of her employment. The military had done exceptional work erasing her. The problem was that erasing someone completely left traces. An absence was a kind of presence. Silence was a kind of scream. The investigator sat across from Sterling and the hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Moss, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had seen administrative nightmares before and was watching another one unfold in real time. "The credentials are fabricated," the investigator said simply. Not angry. Not even surprised. Just stating a fact the way he might state that the sky was blue. All of them. The employment history is a shell. The identity has been constructed to withstand surface-level background checks, but once you move deeper, he tapped the portfolio. There's nothing. Or rather, there's everything underneath it, but it's classified. I can tell by the gaps. I can tell by what's not here. Sterling's face remained a mask of professional concern. This is what we need to address immediately. Patient safety depends on credentialed personnel. He said it like he believed it. He said it like he wasn't the one whose inflated billing codes had steered hospital resources away from actual patient care. He said it like the pharmaceutical supplier he'd been receiving kickbacks from hadn't just lost 3 major contracts because Hannah's obsessive charting had exposed inconsistencies in medication procurement that no one had bothered to notice until she'd flagged them. Dr. Moss leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. You're recommending termination. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending investigation. But given the magnitude of the credential discrepancy, the investigator didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood. A nurse with a fabricated identity was a liability. A nurse with a fabricated identity who had performed unauthorized procedures was grounds for termination before the week was over. Hannah was called into the office at 6:15 p.m. She knew before she opened the door. She could read body language the way other people read text messages, the slight lean backward, the careful distance Sterling maintained, the way Dr. Moss wouldn't quite meet her eyes. The investigator was still there, closing his portfolio as Hannah entered, as if he'd just finished signing a death certificate. We've completed our background verification, Dr. Moss said carefully. There are significant discrepancies in your employment history and nursing credentials. Hannah stood in the center of the room. She didn't ask for a chair. She didn't ask for clarification. She waited, the way you wait before a patrol enters hostile territory, quiet, alert, already accepting what was about to happen. Your credentials appear to be fabricated, the investigator said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just precise. Your identity cannot be verified through any standard database. Your previous employers either don't exist or have no record of employing anyone by your name or resemblance. Additionally, Sterling added, his voice taking on the shape of rehearsed sadness, you performed a needle decompression without physician authorization. That alone constitutes practicing medicine without a license. Combined with credential fraud, he let the sentence hang like a gallows. The termination paperwork was already printed. It sat on Dr. Moss's desk in a manila folder. Hannah saw her name typed across the top, Hannah Clarke. The heading below it read, Unauthorized Medical Procedures and Fraudulent Credentials. We're going to need your hospital badge, Dr. Moss said quietly. And your access credentials. Hannah reached up, unclipped the badge from her scrub pocket, and set it on the desk with the kind of precision she might use to disarm an IED. Click! It landed in the center of the desktop. She didn't hesitate. She didn't protest. She took the pen Dr. Moss offered and signed the termination paperwork in the same careful script she used for medication logs. The signature of a woman who had nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything that mattered 14 years ago in a place called Sanjin where 4 operators died and the military decided that she should never officially exist. Security arrived at 6:44 p.m. 2 guards who'd been pleasant enough during her 3 months on staff, who'd always nodded when she held the door, who now wouldn't meet her eyes as they escorted her from the ICU. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. The silent presence was enough. Nurses she'd worked alongside during 12-hour shifts, nurses she'd shown how to read a difficult cardiac rhythm, nurses she'd helped through their own crises, suddenly became very focused on their patients, their screens, anything except Hannah moving through the hallway for the last time. She cleared her locker at 7:15 p.m. Everything she'd accumulated in 3 months of careful, invisible work fit into a cardboard box that was already beginning to absorb moisture from her damp hands. The cracked mug with the faded anchor emblem, hospital gift shop, $5, the kind of thing a nurse buys because it's functional and no one asks questions about a coffee mug. The dying succulent that had been struggling since she'd brought it from her apartment, wilting in the fluorescent light the way she'd been wilting, slowly and with barely a sound. And the photo, 8 faces, taken 15 years ago at forward operating base Shank, everyone still believing they'd all make it home. Only 4 did. Only Hannah and 3 others whose names were classified, whose deployments were classified, whose scars were classified in ways that made hospitals and credentials and normal civilian life feel like a costume that was finally coming off. The security guard walked her to the exit. Through the sliding glass doors. Into the parking lot. Into the rain. By 8:51 p.m., Hannah stood at the bus stop on Waters Avenue, the cardboard box softening in her hands like a body that was giving up. Rain fell in sheets. Her scrubs were soaked. Water dripped from her hair and traced the line of her jaw, and she didn't move to shield herself because shielding required belief that you were worth shielding, and 14 years of classified erasure had taught her that belief was a luxury she couldn't afford. A car passed, splashing water across her shoes, across the cardboard box. The water pooled in the creases where the box was already failing. She stared down at the photo, 8 faces, taken in a moment when the world still made sense, when orders were clear and enemies were identifiable and coming home meant something because home still existed. For faces smiling. For faces already dead in a way that didn't show on the photograph. The bus arrived at 8:33 p.m., hydraulic doors hissing open like a long exhale. Hannah didn't move. She didn't board. She just stood there as it pulled away, water dripping from the edge of the bus stop shelter, the cardboard box heavy as a casket in her hands, alone in the rain in a city that had never known her real name, holding everything she had left in the world that she could prove was real. Inside Oak Creek Memorial, behind the steel and glass and fluorescent lights, Dr. Sterling clinked glasses with the hospital board members in the executive lounge. Scotch neat. The fraud investigation had been safely redirected toward Hannah's fabricated credentials. The compliance investigator had found her guilty of being a ghost. Sterling smiled the smile of a man who understood that sometimes the best way to survive a knife fight is to ensure everyone's attention is focused on the person who's already bleeding. What Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had spent 16 hours holding a collapsing field hospital together while rounds came in at 6-second intervals, and she had spent 14 years holding a fractured identity together while civilian life tried to break her into smaller pieces. And she had spent 90 minutes saving a Delta Force colonel's life with nothing but a steady hand and 14 years of muscle memory, and that colonel was now picking up his secure phone in the ICU, water pitcher untouched on his bedside table, and making a single call to JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, with 3 words that would begin the process of bringing his lifeline back from the dead. The Black Hawk appeared at 0600 hours like judgment descending from the sky, its rotors thundering against the morning silence, the rotor wash flattening everything below it in concentric waves of force. The helipad at Oak Creek Memorial had never seen anything like it. The hospital's landing pad was meant for civilian medevacs, not military aircraft, not this kind of authority made manifest in metal and noise. The bird settled with the precision of a surgical instrument, and before the rotors had fully spooled down, 2 Delta operators in full kit dropped from the side rails, plate carriers laden with magazines, helmets with push-to-talk headsets, the kind of men who moved through space as if they owned it by right of competence. They crossed the helipad in tactical formation, boots hitting concrete in perfect synchronization, and pushed through the ICU doors without waiting for anyone to wave them through. One operator had eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, and he moved with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator. The other was built like a load-bearing wall with a jaw that could cut glass. Both of them radiated the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The ICU went silent the moment they entered. Nurses froze mid-task. Monitors beeped in the absence of human sound. A resident stepped backward into the wall. The operator with the storm-colored eyes approached the nurse station, his voice dropping low and even like a tank idling in a garage. Senior Chief Clarke. Call sign Lifeline. We know she's here. We're taking custody. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The head nurse's face went pale. She pointed down the corridor without speaking, her hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from recognition that something on a scale far beyond hospital protocol had just walked through her ICU. The two operators moved down the hallway with weapons-ready posture, and when they reached the colonel's room, the man in the bed was already sitting upright despite post-operative restrictions, his surgical drains still in place, his foreline still running, a smile spreading across his face like dawn breaking over a valley. "Lifeline," the colonel said, and his voice carried the weight of 16 hours of siege. "The hospital staff doesn't know who they've been hiding from them." He gestured for the operators to close the door, then he began to speak, and what he said traveled through that hospital like electricity through copper wire. He told them about a Navy SEAL corpsman in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley, how that hospital had been under fire for 16 hours straight, how the rounds came in at 6-second intervals, how the roof had partially collapsed and she'd kept working beneath falling concrete with blood on her gloves and a casualty count that should have broken anyone with a normal nervous system. He told them how she'd trained 12 local medics in the span of 14 minutes, how she'd made triage decisions that saved 47 lives, how she'd held a man's femoral artery closed with her bare hand for 8 minutes while another medic found a vascular clamp because the power was out and they were working by chemical light sticks. He told them how she'd never once stopped moving, never once looked at her own injuries, 2 through rounds in the left shoulder, a shrapnel laceration along her ribs, a fractured radius that she'd splinted with surgical tape and kept working through. His voice didn't waver. His eyes didn't leave the operators' faces. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Then the doors burst open, and a 3-star general walked through with the presence of a tsunami in dress uniform. Behind him came an FBI agent in a dark suit, and behind them came the hospital administrator, the board members, and Dr. Sterling, who had arrived thinking this was a vindication, thinking this moment would be his triumph, not his annihilation. The general moved to the colonel's bedside and opened a classified file folder, then read it aloud with trembling reverence, each word landing like a hammer blow, 2 silver stars. Pause. Reaction rippled through the room. The colonel's eyes widened, the operator's spine straightened fractionally. Silver star. Another pause. The administrator's mouth opened. For Purple Hearts. The FBI agent's expression didn't change, but one of the Delta operators made a small sound, not quite a word, something between respect and grief. And a Navy Cross. The folder closed. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the general turned to Dr. Sterling, and his voice changed. It became the voice of a man who had spent 30 years watching cowards destroy good people, and he had run out of patience. "You tried to bury a decorated war hero," the general said quietly, "to hide your crimes." Sterling's face went from pale to gray to the color of old newspaper. "Military intelligence reviewed your billing codes at 0200 hours. Pharmaceutical kickbacks. Inflated coding. Falsified patient records." The FBI agent stepped forward and read Sterling his rights in a voice devoid of emotion. "Dr. Marcus Sterling, you are suspended from medical practice pending a federal fraud investigation. Your medical license is flagged. Your credentials are stripped. Your practices at this hospital are under review for potential harm to patients." Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots in the sudden movement of hospital staff backing away from Sterling. The hospital administrator who had signed Hannah's termination paperwork began stammering an apology, but the general cut him off with a single glance. The news cameras rolled. Sterling's hand shook. His medical career, built over 23 years, was being dismantled in real time, in a public ICU, in front of the staff he'd lorded over, in front of the one person whose competence had exposed him completely. He tried to speak. His voice cracked. One of the Delta operators made a radio call, his voice crisp and professional. "Angel 6, we need location on Lifeline. Last known position was bus stop, Broughton Street, 0430 hours." But Hannah wasn't at the bus stop anymore. She'd made it to the women's shelter 6 blocks away, had traded her wet cardboard box for a metal chair in a fluorescent-lit community center, was sitting beneath lights that buzzed like angry wasps, still holding the cracked mug with the faded anchor emblem as if it was the only thing keeping her tethered to her own identity. She didn't expect a Black Hawk to land 3 blocks away. She didn't expect Delta operators to walk through the shelter doors looking for a nurse who wasn't a nurse, a woman who was officially deceased, a person whose entire existence had been classified and filed away and denied. But that's what happened at 0638 hours. The operators walked in, and when they saw her, sitting beneath those buzzing lights, still in borrowed scrubs, still holding the cracked mug, one of them knelt down and extended his hand and said simply, "Welcome home, Senior Chief." They brought her back to Oak Creek Memorial in the Black Hawk, and when she walked through those ICU doors, the entire staff rose in spontaneous applause. Sterling was being escorted out in handcuffs at that exact moment, federal agents on either side of him, his career cremated, his fraud exposed, his leverage obliterated. He and Hannah passed each other in the corridor. He saw her face. She didn't look at him. One measured breath. Her composure never broke. The submissive nurse who'd knelt to clean his spilled lunch was gone, replaced by something that wore the same face but carried the weight of nations. 6 months later, Hannah wore dress whites, crisp and perfect, seemed sharp enough to draw blood, to Oak Creek Memorial's rededication ceremony. The faded unit patch was sewn openly on her sleeve now, no longer hidden in a jacket lining. She stood at a podium and spoke about protocol and honor, about the difference between a credential and a character, about the nurses who did the hardest work in the quietest way. The colonel sat in the third row, fully recovered, back to active duty, his own uniform bearing the scars of pride. After the ceremony, Hannah passed him in the hallway. He touched the unit patch on her sleeve, his fingers tracing the worn fabric, and said one sentence, "Welcome home, Senior Chief." She nodded once. A complete conversation. Everything that needed saying had already been said in blood and silence and 16 hours under fire and the refusal to break. Across town, at the strip mall pharmacy, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table in a discount polo shirt with an insurance company logo, selling supplemental health policies to disinterested shoppers. His hands that had once held scalpels with authority, held promotional flyers now. A former colleague walked past without acknowledgement. Sterling stared down at his fingers as if they belonged to someone else. At the hospital, Hannah trained a new group of nurses, and when one dropped a tray in the cafeteria, a clattering explosion of ceramic and silverware, Hannah was the first to kneel and help clean it up. The young nurse apologized profusely. Hannah stood, brushed off her hands, and said one sentence that would follow that nurse through her entire career: "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She walked back to her office where the cracked mug sat beside a healthy succulent and the photograph of her unit, finally displayed in the light where it belonged, finally allowed to be seen, finally acknowledged as the truth it had always been. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.